slide that you see in front of you is a picture of Denise Levertov, probably she's probably in her 50s there, maybe early 60s. She does not live a long life, by the way. She's 73, I think, when she passes, and no, 74. And but she lived a full life for sure. And she has one of the more interesting backgrounds of anybody who wrote in America as a poet, and anybody who became known as a religious poet. Mark German, by the way, son of a disciple pastor who taught for years and years at Vanderbilt University, has a real great piece on her about how she was disdained because of her avid and passionate use of her faith in writing poems. There is a basic prejudice in the poetry world against people who are really faithful. And I could be challenged by some of the people in the literary world and say, no, that's not the case. They just write bad poetry. Well, no, they don't. T.S. Eliot, very, very religious in his own way. By the way, one of the biggest anti-Semites that you're ever going to see in literature or anywhere else. But he was very, very faithful. Frederick Buechner was one of the most faithful and one of the greatest writers that America has ever produced. But he gets categorized as, oh, he's that Christian writer. And Denise Levertov, similarly, in a way, has been not castigated, but kind of quarantined, if you will, to being a religious poet by some people. Now, there are other people who do regard her as she was a great poet, and as her poetry continues to be greatly appreciated and used. But since her death, and see, it's been 26 years now, she's kind of faded away out of awareness among folks in the literary world. And a group that I don't know as much as I should about, a group called the Language Poets, would probably not find much use for Denise Levertov, and in their non-referential kind of emphasis, in their parallel to what is called deconstructionism in the literary world. Please, if you, the people in the library, poke the person next to you who just fell asleep when I said deconstructionism, okay? I'm not trying to be academic, but I'm trying to set the context for Denise Levertov these days in the literary world. She's not Robert Frost. She's not Emily Dickinson. She's not Sylvia Plath. She's not Maya Angelou, but she is a great poet, and a person of great faith, and also a great soul. So we're going to go through these next two slides. I'm going to talk real fast, and if you have questions later, please let me know, and I'll try to address those. But we'll look at her biography timeline. She's born in Ilford, Essex. She's the third daughter of a Welsh mother who happens to be a Congregationalist, and a Russian father who has a very interesting background. Paul Levertov, with two F's instead of the V, was part of a long line of Sephardic Jews. Now, Sephardic Jews, as opposed to Ashkenazic Jews, are the Jews that they populated Spain instead of Eastern Europe. There's some different traditions and heritages that accrue to that. Her father will convert to Christianity and eventually becomes an Anglican priest. And it is his mysticism and his attention to the Hasidic traditions in Judaism that also inform her life. As we go through this biography, pay attention to the various places that she lives. She's born in England, but she will not regard herself as an English origin poet. She will understand herself to be a European. When she is a mere 5 years old, she will declare that she's going to be a writer. She's educated at home. Her mother reads her poetry, and authors such as Willa Cather, Joseph Conrad, Charles Dickens, Leo Tolstoy. Her father's spiritual journey contributes to her interest in the mysticism, as I said. He is active in Jewish-Christian dialogue in Britain between World War I and World War II. And in some of the videos, she will talk about how World War I kind of hovered in her home, as it did in many British families, kind of haunting them. And then as she will experience war up close and personal, she will serve as a nurse during World War II. At age 12, she sends some of her poems to T.S. Eliot. And this has been verified. She didn't just say it. They have found it in Eliot's archives. So she's just barely 12 years old when she does that. During World War II, she will serve as a nurse, especially during the bombings that pummeled the London landscape. She will work in an antique store and bookstore in London, and then it's then in 46 that she publishes her first book. She's not even 23 years old, called The Double Image. She travels to Holland to teach and also to get an abortion from a pregnancy she has with a man named Norman Potter. And she will meet an American writer there, Mitch Goodman. She marries him on December the 2nd. They moved to the US in 48. They settle in New York City, but they do their summers in Maine. And this will be a repeated action for them later on in their marriage. Her son Nikolai is born in 49. Then the family lives from 50 to 52 in France and Italy. Then they return to New York. Her father dies, and her mother thereafter moves in with her and Goodman. In 56, she becomes a naturalized American citizen. She's associated with the Black Mountain School of Poetry. There's a friendship her husband has with a guy named Robert Creeley. And they base their work on the thesis that poetry and writing is linked to daily life. The works of William Carlos Williams, some of whose poetry you may be familiar with, influence her writing. And she has a lot of correspondence with William Carlos Williams, which you can kind of find on the internet, by the way. And she's part of a generation of poets that includes Adrienne Rich, Philip Levine, W.S. Merwin, Hayden Carruth, Galway Kinnell, James Wright. It's okay if you're not familiar with all these poets. Pick one, find them out, check them out. I would suggest, by the way, Galway Kinnell, if you want to know another poet besides Denise Levertov. From 56 to 58, she will move to Guadalajara, and later, and I don't know how to say this, I have practiced it and I can't find out how to say it, Oaxaca, I think, in Mexico. And so she'll live there almost 2.5 years. In 59, her book of poems called With Eyes at the Back of Our Heads establishes her as a significant American poet. Then they move back to New York City, back from Mexico in 60. Then she becomes poetry editor off and on with a journal that's still in existence today called The Nation. And she will protest and organize against the Vietnam War. She's arrested multiple times for protesting. She has the distinction of having received a Guggenheim Fellowship. She teaches poetry at the YMCA in New York. Then she's a visiting professor and poet in residence at MIT. I never knew that MIT would have such a thing, but she does do that. So in 72, she travels with Muriel Rukeyser to Hanoi, Vietnam, North Vietnam. Again, this is in an effort to try to bring the Vietnam War to a close. In 75, she and Goodman divorce. Then she wins a very distinguished prize in the poetry world, the Lenore Marshall Poetry Prize, for a book called The Freeing of the Dust. Then she will serve as a poetry editor for Mother Jones, and then her mother dies in Mexico in 77. She will teach at Stanford University, and while there, she befriends Robert McAfee Brown, and who is a great religionist, and he will be eventually at Union Seminary, I believe, or Yale. Franciscan priest Murray Bodo serves as a spiritual advisor for her, and eventually will put together a book of devotions based on her work, and you can find that online through Amazon. She will also befriend another great poet contemporarily, a woman named Carolyn Forche. She'll convert then to Christianity. She kind of had been an agnostic, post her upbringing, but she'll convert to Christianity. She then is coming to the end of her career, approaching 65, 64, 65. She'll sell her archives to Stanford University, although some of her archives are across the country as well. She moves to Seattle, and she becomes a Roman Catholic. She receives a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship. She becomes a senior fellow with them, and she retires from teaching officially in 93. She is 70 years old by that time, I believe. She's 70 then. And she will have a reconciliation with her son, and I couldn't nail down that when that exactly happened, what year, but they had been estranged, and then she got to be with him, and they reconciled, and she will die eventually on the 20th of December, 1997, of cardiac failure due to intestinal necrosis resulting from lymphoma at Swedish Hospital in Seattle. The themes of Denise Levertov's life, one is movement. Her journey is ever westward. She goes from England to the US, from nursing the afflicted during World War II in London to protesting the Vietnam War in the US. From living in New York City, even further westward, to living in Seattle. From being a European to acquiring US citizenship. And she goes onward from the romanticism of English verse to the American idiom. From the religious pluralism in her childhood to the agnosticism in her young adulthood to Roman Catholicism in her maturity, from claiming no particular faith to discovering and being claimed by the Christian faith and a sure sense of God's presence in the world. She keeps two personal vigils. She combines, she weds, if you will, social activism and artistry. And there's a lot of poets who have done that over the years. She is one of the more premier poets in that tradition. But secondly, she has a focus on mystery as a constant theme in her poetry and in her calling as a poet. She says, acknowledgement and celebration of mystery probably constitutes the most consistent theme of my poetry. She is a person and a poet of peace. She protested the Vietnam War. She was a critic of the atrocities in El Salvador, and in that she joined forces with Carolyn Forche, by the way. And she was a proponent for nuclear disarmament as well. Next slide. For Levertov, with regard to prayer and poetry, she regards them as intertwined. What I experience when I'm writing a poem is close to prayer, she says. She says, I was really amazed at how close the exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola were to a poet or novelist imagining a scene. You try to compose that scene in your imagination, place yourself there, you establish who you are and where you stand, and then you look at what you see. So those are combinations. And then this is what I would call a found prayer. I don't know if those of you who know poetry, that there are sometimes poems that are called found poems. Let's say you're reading a letter and you see something that's really lyrically beautiful or something that's said just so exquisitely. There's a line at the end of Raymond Carver's story, A Small Good Thing, that says, and they did not think of leaving. I think that I could take that last paragraph and put it into a poem, and especially with that last line, and they did not think of leaving. It's just beautiful. Well, let's flip this on its head and let's find the prayer in Denise Levertov's poetry. So I'm going to read this aloud and see if you can imagine it as a prayer. I know this happiness is provisional, the looming presence, great suffering, great fear, withdraw only into peripheral vision. But ineluctable, this shimmering of wind in the blue leaves, this flood of stillness widening this lake of sky, this need to dance, this need to kneel, this mystery. To me, that's a found prayer. And this is her poem called Of Being. And I put the picture of her in her poetic pose just because of that last line, or third to last line, this need to dance. This is what I call found prayer number 2. And this is primary wonder. And this is an exceedingly extraordinarily powerful prayer. This poem is quoted and cited many times by others, and especially by bloggers across the face of the American continent and also in the English-speaking world, and used by evangelicals, Catholics, mainline Protestants, progressives, and has a curious usage. When I tried to find somebody from England who would be reciting this, so I said, I'll find somebody with an English accent doing this. Well, it was okay until the last 3 lines. They excised any reference to God and only wanted to say the line rather than void, and that it is still sustained hour by hour. That's how they ended it. So they aborted her words. They excised them because it was not to their sensibilities appropriate to invoke the name God. I mean, I don't have an explanation, but I thought it was an insult to Denise Levertov to do that. Mary Gordon, in fact, when she recites this line, and in her lecture, she deletes the phrase Lord and says that, and that, O Creator, hallowed one, you still hour by hour sustain it. And so that's a little bit more understandable, not wanting to use male specific metaphors for God. But I think that you can explain that somebody is a person of their times, and you should honor their words in the original. You really just should. So I'm going to read this. I don't have an English accent, but I hope that you'll follow along and feel its power. And I think this is a prayer, and especially in the second verse, the second stanza, if you will, or past the words and then, where there's an address to another. Days pass when I forget the mystery, problems insoluble and problems offering their own ignored solutions jostle for my attention. They crowd its antechamber, along with a host of diversions, my courtiers, wearing their colored cloths, caps and bells. And then, once more, the quiet mystery is present to me. The throng's clamor recedes. The mystery that there is anything at all, let alone cosmos, joy, memory, everything, rather than void. And that, O Lord, Creator, hallowed one, you still, hour by hour, sustain it. I think you could put that in the middle of the book of Psalms and it would seem appropriate. So I have a suggestion for praying after the example of Denise Levertov, and that is to use primary wonder and to give thanks and recite these words that there is anything at all, and that, O Lord, Creator, hallowed one, you still, hour by hour, sustain it. And if you care to see something that's sustained, just look up at the moon that I think is approaching full moon status these days, and just say, how in heaven's name does that thing stay up there? How does the sun nurture our world? How does anything happen in the cosmos that is sustaining us this day? Or look at a loved one and understand their care and tender love for you. Or consider your congregation and how it is always there for you. Maybe not perfectly in the way that you always want, but that it continues, it abides, and how God sustains you all in your community of faith.